Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Roadhouse Blues, Morrison, The Doors, and the Death Days of the Sixties, by Bob Batchelor. Narrated by B.J. Harrison. James Douglas Morrison. Born December 8th, 1943, Melbourne, Florida. Death, July 3rd, 1971. Education: St. Petersburg Junior College, Florida State University, University of California, Los Angeles, Bachelors of Arts, 1965. Jim Morrison was inspired by an array of poets, writers, and philosophers. Some of his influences were American writers, such as F. Scott Fitzgerald, William Faulkner, and Ernest Hemingway. One of his favorites was Norman Mailer, with whom Morrison shared a deeply questioning nature and a turn toward the dark aspects of the human condition, as in the singer's favorite novel, The Deer Park, 1955. Jim drew from the beat poets, Allen Ginsberg, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and Michael McClure, and philosophers and writers Franz Kafka, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Vladimir Nabokov. Morrison owed a major intellectual debt to Arthur Rimbaud, whom he idolized as a poet and a 19th-century mythmaker. In film, Jim looked to Jean-Luc Godard. He also drew inspiration from James Joyce and Louis-Ferdinand Céline. Musical influences included Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, Elvis Presley, and Bob Dylan. Morrison had 2 books of poems published in his lifetime. He had others published posthumously. Raymond Daniel Manzarek, Jr. Born February 12, 1939, in Chicago, South Side. Death May 20th, 2013. Education: DePaul University, Bachelor of Arts, 1960. University of California, Los Angeles, Master of Fine Arts, 1965. Ray Manzarek was a classically trained blues-jazz keyboard player, but learned to play bass parts on the piano in a simplistic, repetitive technique with his left hand, which produced the Doors' hallmark sound. His style grew from the music he heard obsessively listening to the radio as a kid on the south side of Chicago. Boogie-woogie piano music and Chicago-based blues, played by Little Richard, Fats Domino, and Muddy Waters. His bass keyboard influences included Albert Ammons, Clarence Pinetop Smith, and Meade Lux Lewis. From jazz, Manzarek drew from the greats, including John Coltrane and Billy Evans. He also borrowed from the Latin-infused jazz popular in Southern California. Similar to Morrison, his intellectual debts ranged from the Beats to contemporary European filmmakers. He brought his film influences into the Doors' idea of creating musical theater. Those influences ranged from Ingmar Bergman and Federico Fellini to Akira Kurosawa and Satyajit Ray. Robert Allen Krieger. Born January 8th, 1946, in Los Angeles. Education: University of California, Santa Barbara, University of California, Los Angeles. Robbie Krieger's early musical influences included Frank Sinatra, Elvis Presley, and Fats Domino. Krieger's parents were classical music fans, so he listened to a lot of that particular genre growing up. Hearing Chuck Berry convinced him to play rock and roll guitar, but he was initially a classical player, focusing on flamenco and jazz. Other jazz, blues, and rock guitarists who influenced him include Wes Montgomery, Robert Johnson, Albert King, and Larry Carlton. As a teenager, Krieger played in a jug band, a form popular in California at the time. Like many folk aficionados, he loved Bob Dylan, as well as the blues-laden and folk sounds of Kerner, Ray and Glover, and the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. He counts Joan Baez as another important musical figure. Later, he and John Densmore studied Indian music with Ravi Shankar. John Paul Densmore, born December 1, 1944, in Los Angeles. Education: Santa Monica City College, California State University, Northridge. Originally a pianist who liked to improvise on classic and pop songs, John Densmore took up percussion in high school as a member of the band, which impacted his thinking on dynamics and the power of playing drums. His major influences came from jazz, including John Coltrane's drummer, Elvin Jones, and Art Blakey. Densmore also enjoyed Coltrane and Miles Davis. Densmore's use of bossa nova, samba, which had been developed in Brazil, was a driving force on many Doors songs. Foreword. Almost alone among the flower power acts along the Sunset Strip or down in Laurel Canyon, the Doors radiated menace. Only the band Love, fronted by the pugnacious Arthur Lee, could compete with Jim Morrison and company for atomizing the plastic veneer of a Los Angeles fantasia, that of a West Coast paradise awash in good vibrations. But as Bob Batchelor outlines in Roadhouse Blues, the short but explosive career of the Doors dovetailed almost seamlessly with the rise and fall of the pseudo-utopian 60s. No matter what the Mamas and the Papas or Jackie DeShannon or the Beach Boys sang, the dark side of the hippie generation loomed like an eclipse. And for a few unruly years, the Doors were there to chronicle the blackening sun. Their sound thumped and thundered, reflecting their era and projecting it out to audiences that were unnerved by its energy, writes Batchelor. Jim knew what people wanted. America was conceived in violence. Americans are attracted to violence, he later explained. They attach themselves to processed violence, out of cans. They're TV hypnotized. They're emotionally dead. The attraction-revulsion theme, centering on elemental forces of light, dark, love, hate, life, and death, would have been impossible for most bands to implement, but the Doors were staking their future on that principle. Even with such idiosyncratic talents as Brian Wilson, Sky Saxon, Captain Beefheart, Dino Valenti, and Arthur Lee as regional contemporaries, Jim Morrison stood out. In Morrison, the Doors had a frontman equal parts Lord Byron, Artaud, and Scott Walker. Inspired by a theater background, before he graduated from UCLA with a degree in cinematography, and the poetry of the beats, Morrison brought a rare erudition to the mic stand and the lyric sheet. It was Nietzsche and Rimbaud, however, who drove Morrison to live on the dangerous edge of things. From Nietzsche, Morrison seemed to draw a general way of life from Zarathustra. One must have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. From Rimbaud, Morrison borrowed much more, including the pre-surrealist stylings for his verse and the destructive notion of altered states of mind amounting to enlightenment. A poet makes himself a visionary, Rimbaud wrote, through a long, boundless, and systematized disorganization of all the senses. Also like Rimbaud, who was often flea-bitten and adrift, Morrison adopted vagabondage as a modus vivendi. For the last 5 or 6 years of his life, Morrison had no fixed residence. Indeed, when he fortuitously ran into Ray Manzarek on Venice Beach in July 1965, he was essentially homeless, dropping acid regularly, crashing with friends, reading dog-eared paperbacks, writing poetry with the booming Pacific waves as a soundtrack. Morrison straddled over two overlapping eras, soon to be bygone. The last decades to produce the bohemian littérateur and the hippie dropout as social types. In Roadhouse Blues, Bob Batchelor chronicles the whirlwind rise and fall of the Doors, and how their brief but riotous career paralleled the chaos of the 1960s. Batchelor, a cultural historian who has written about topics as diverse as Mad Men, the Prohibition bootlegger George Remus, and Marvel Comics super impresario Stan Lee, turns his critical eye to the days when rock and roll, and particularly the Doors, was considered revolutionary. The notion that music could transform society at the individual level and as a whole permeated the 60s, writes Batchelor. We might see this as trite today, but the idea felt alive then, palpable, and this gives context to how the Doors were formed and the philosophies they embraced. Named after an Aldous Huxley memoir, which itself paraphrased William Blake, about the psychedelic experience, the Doors, writes Batchelor, were nothing like the Beatles or the American rock bands that were starting to gain traction at the time. Featuring a classically trained pianist playing bass lines on a Fender Rhodes bass piano with his left hand and mesmerizing runs on a Vox Continental organ with his right, the Doors were unique from the beginning. Add a guitarist with training in flamenco and a drummer whose idol was Elvin Jones, and you have genuine originals, even during an era as experimental as the 60s were. At times, the Doors sounded funereal, other times vibrant, still others carnivalesque, and finally they bordered on apocalyptic. The hellfire atmosphere the Doors emanated is best represented by The End, their epic phantasmagoria that culminates, lyrically, in family annihilation. With his steady baritone, his gaunt good looks, his skin-tight leather pants, and his open defiance of all that was wholesome, Morrison became an unlikely sex symbol, even popping up on the pages of Vogue and 16 magazine. The disconnect between Morrison and the teeny bopper set, who read idealized portraits of the Lizard King in 16, led critics to turn against the Doors, especially after they released The Soft Parade, their fourth album, featuring brass horns, saxophones, and a string orchestra. To his detractors, Lester Bangs called him Bozo Dionysus, Morrison was a pretentious phony, cribbing from the Living Theatre, Brecht, and the beatniks of the 1950s. This critique fails on two levels. First, Morrison lived his ideals, no matter how much those ideals were anathema to the armchair set. Like some of his peers, David Crosby, Grace Slick, and Graham Parsons, Morrison abandoned a comfortable upbringing to pursue his personal vision. And when he died in 1971 at the age of 27, his conscious pursuit of oblivion could hardly be considered insincere. Second, precious few pop acts were infusing their work with avant-garde influences, and to consider that a drawback seems almost parochial. But critics were not the only ones who eyed the Doors and Morrison suspiciously. To what has been popularly known as the establishment, Morrison was a moving target, with his own FBI file and a series of run-ins with law enforcement based on his amoral pursuit of hedonism and his potential as some sort of revolutionary spark plug. For the Love generation, it was business as usual. The rock and roll lifestyle came under fire when tied so closely to drug use, rebellion, and anarchy, writes Batchelor. The Rolling Stones were pitched to the world as the anti-Beatles, a group of young hellions who epitomized the wild side. Their mix of loud rock music tinged with rhythm and blues, another trait shared with the Doors, provided the soundtrack for the global counterculture. For those in power, however, their revolution had to be quelled. Today, it seems almost inconceivable that the lead singer of one of the biggest pop acts in America could be maced by police before a concert, then pummeled after the show and dragged off to jail. But Morrison so embodied the counterculture, and all its nihilism, that his celebrity status offered no immunity from stormtrooper tactics. If anything, his stature as a leather-clad rabble-rouser only made him more of a mark for law and order zealots. In 1969, Morrison, the self-styled shaman showman, no longer enamored with fame, but still drinking and abusing drugs, was hurtling toward self-destruction when he was charged with lewd and lascivious behavior, indecent exposure, profanity, and drunkenness stemming from a shambolic concert in Miami. His subsequent trial and conviction effectively ended The Doors as a live act and left Morrison contemplating poetry and film as alternatives to music. He would never get the chance to reinvent himself. If the Doors were not the embodiment of revolution during the Age of Aquarius, they were certainly prophets of its failure. In Roadhouse Blues, Bob Batchelor contextualizes the Doors' phenomenon with verve and a solid understanding of the electrifying and often contradictory 60s. Carlos Acevedo, New York City, September 2022. 1. Lighting America's Fire. Light My Fire hit its stride as the song tumbled toward the end. It seemed as if all of America had heard Ray Manzarek's carnivalesque organ when the song rocketed to number 1 months earlier. As Manzarek played, Robbie Krieger churned out chords and fell into rhythm behind him. John Densmore pushed the beat with an intensity that belied his smooth demeanor. The sound was instantly recognizable and unlike anything rock fans had ever heard. They knew it by heart after hearing it on constant rotation all summer long. In January, when the record hit stores, no one would have anticipated that a moody, psychedelic single by an unheralded band would soon top the charts. Now, here they were, The Ed Sullivan Show, their first national television appearance. Jim Morrison growled out the last "Faya," then looked heavenward. He raised the microphone to his mouth and faced the camera in profile. Prolific, Adonis, the shaggy hair, the cheekbones beaming out at America. As Densmore bashed the drums behind him, the leather-clad singer puffed out his chest at an angle and cocked his head the opposite way. He dropped his right arm alongside his thin frame and kicked his hips left, the crafted pose of America's latest teen heartthrob. For millions of families gathered together across the nation, The Sullivan Show was a Sunday night tradition. Morrison's midriff appeared squarely in the middle of the screen as the camera moved in for a close-up. His well-worn white shirt with frayed cuffs peeked out from the black leather jacket, which contrasted against the gaudy red stage backdrop of actual doors hanging from the walls with day-glow yellow accents. Imagine the thoughts running through the mind of the countless American dads who had grown up listening to big bands like Benny Goodman and Glenn Miller. They glanced up at the TV set, the cacophony drawing their attention for just a moment. Quickly their eyes dialed in on the spectacle. Jim's leather pants were slung low on his waist. Something else was prominent on display, practically unavoidable. What could these dads have thought, and how did they see that moment? As Ray's organ grinded on, mesmerizing, the camera zoomed out. Morrison stood stoically, not looking up. Then, twirling the microphone in his outstretched fingers, he straightened and flung the cord over his shoulder, as if holding a quiver of arrows. Then, in a heartbeat, he smashed down, using the mic to hit the last note as the audience's first wave of shrieks struck the band. The teenage girls who filled the auditorium seats that night were ignited by the hit single and the chance to see the beautiful rock god in real life. As the applause and screams grew louder, the singer finally recognized what had just happened. He drew them in, then looked up, vulnerable. Feeling the power of the moment, Jim bared his teeth, something between a snarl and a smile. He let out a little breath and stepped toward Sullivan. When the camera cut to the host, he clapped and mouthed something like, "Good job," toward Morrison, even though he must have already determined that the Doors would be banned forever from his show for using the lyrics, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher." The show's producer had asked them to change it following that afternoon's sound check. Ed thought they all agreed that they would abide the decision. Recalling that evening, Krieger wrote in his memoir that the guys were nervous doing Sullivan for the first time, perhaps no one more than Jim. He didn't like these appearances, sensing an inauthenticity in performing in the middle of day with the hot television lights beating down and everything so unnaturally bright. Morrison liked a darker world. On tour, the singer frequently asked for the lights to be lowered at shows, especially in larger venues. Mood meant something to him. He preferred the dingy clubs, where the band had developed their sound since forming just a little more than 2 years earlier. He also liked to have a couple of drinks to set the tone for the evening. Television, on the other hand, made Morrison edgy and self-conscious, though no one could have imagined Jim lacking confidence based on the performance that he had just delivered. Rather than Jim making some artistic point by sticking to the original lyrics, Krieger thought that he simply forgot to change them as requested, most likely too caught up in the moment. Or maybe he wasn't even paying attention when Sullivan's producer asked him to. We'll never know the full truth, but it's problematic to attribute the mistake to anxiety. Jim's anti-authority streak was too strong. He loathed anyone who had the audacity to tell him what to do. When pushed, Morrison rammed back harder. What could they do to him if he didn't sing the other phrase? If this were gasoline, Jim was willing to pull out his matches. The Doors performed on The Ed Sullivan Show on September 17, 1967, just 3 years after the Beatles transformed the music business and American culture. They had almost single-handedly revolutionized music and distracted the nation from the tragedy of John F. Kennedy's assassination. Other guests who shared the bill with the Doors that night included actor Yul Brynner and rising comedian Rodney Dangerfield. But it was the Doors and Morrison they wanted. Scores of teeny boppers waited in line on 54th Street to get a seat. Backstage, Ed mingled with the guests in the dressing rooms, but it was his son-in-law, Bob Precht, who served as producer of the collective cacophony that was America's most beloved variety show. After getting through sound check, Precht made up with the band backstage. "You boys look great when you smile," he supposedly told them, adding, "Don't be so serious." Of course, a world-class wise-ass like Jim couldn't let that slide. "Well, we're kind of a sullen group," he allegedly told the producer. Morrison and his bandmates had worked hard to perfect that moody, glowering aura. This was Jim's zone, the place where he could turn on and off different personas depending on his frame of mind and the crowd's reaction to the music. The Doors projected darkness. Fans would follow them, either to live out their own fantasies through Morrison or to hold the group up as anti-heroes in a mostly generic pop music world. The Doors were nothing like the Beatles or the American rock bands that were starting to gain traction at the time. Although, on paper, they were just 4 young guys in a rock group, they exuded a certain dangerousness. Why did this matter as they prepared to go on the Sullivan Show? In short, there was no way the Doors or Morrison were going to go on national television and pretend to be smiley or cheerful. That wasn't their gig. As if the smile comment wasn't enough, Precht was the one who had told the band that Morrison couldn't sing the lyrics much higher on national television. Despite teenagers and other young men dying in the jungles of Vietnam and civil rights activists being brutalized in the American South, the producer feared that TV viewers might interpret the lyrics, correctly, as a drug reference. Speaking for the entire band, Ray told Precht that they would alter the lyrics. The decision dropped a cloud over the pre-show festivities, which up to that point had been fun, and the guys clowned around together to allay some jitters. Ray, Robbie, and John weren't really sure what Jim would do when the cameras rolled. Knowing the singer, though, they had a hunch he wouldn't comply. Densmore remembered Jim's reaction as rage, and that Morrison represented a possible explosion too near the surface to mess with. Years later, Robbie recalled the episode differently, portraying the band as defiant and unified in the face of the producer's demand. "We thought they were joking, wanting us to change the lyrics on the #1 song in America. We decided to just do the song as is. We didn't care." What did America see that night? They may not have realized it, but it was the rise of a new spirit emanating from the West. The Doors would take the influences of the West Coast, psychedelics, jam band techniques, free love, peace, activism, and a concern for life and the larger world, and deliver it to the nation. California, according to one journalist, was the land of culture and thinking man's society. As a result, about 75% of the groups hitting today call somewhere in California their home. Jim was even more direct, explaining, "The path of the sun leads to the west. There's a new life out there. New York is decaying. The West is vibrant and strong." Ray echoed his sentiment, noting the vitality of their adopted home. In an interview, he said, "You feel closer to the earth when the weather is always warmer, and you can be sunk in seawater up to your nose 20 minutes from home." Although the song "The End" became a crowd favorite, and infamous, based on its Oedipal overtones and foreboding essence, the last line is literally a command. Jim urged the listener to get to California. After the declaration, "The West is the best," he admonished, "Get here, and we'll do the rest." Los Angeles, Morrison's adopted home, could be considered the end of the nation. But what he meant by the rest is unclear. If nothing else, the end is the first in a series of love letters he would write to the City of Lights that exposed its mystery, allure, and seedy underbelly. Danger lurked there with Jim as the devil-on-the-shoulder guide to L.A.'s charms and decadence. The West, as America's cure-all and future, had long been a part of the national character. But the region was still misunderstood and constantly in flux. While much of the nation might have viewed the West through the lens of cowboys and ranchers, like on the hit TV show Gunsmoke and Bonanza, the real West had a long history of jumbling together different people, cultures, and experiences, like the Native Americans who settled the region, and the Spanish people who explored it and set up a network of missions up and down the coast. Yet Bonanza was the #1 rated show on television in 1967, the same time the Doors exploded onto the scene with Light My Fire. How did Middle America rectify these unrelated images? One, the exemplar of the new youth culture. The other, Hollywood's repackaging of a mythic and mostly inaccurate past. A more accurate model for the changing West was probably the 1965 Watts riots, when a botched drunk driving arrest unleashed a week of mayhem and death on Los Angeles. Over a 6-day period in August, 34 people died, more than 1,000 were injured, and 4,000 were arrested. The riots were sparked when Lee Minicus,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?